There is a place buried so deep in the wreckage of forgotten history that most people walk right past it. A place where escaped slaves, naval deserters, and condemned criminals built something that the crowned kings of Europe, with all their gold and all their armies, were terrified to acknowledge: a working democracy, decades before America would dare to dream of one. Long before any European sail crested the horizon above the Bahama Islands, the Lucian people moved through these waters as if the sea itself belonged to them. They were Arawakan-speaking peoples, gentle by most accounts, expert fishermen and navigators who had inhabited these low coral archipelagos for at least 1,000 years before Columbus anchored his ships in their shallow turquoise bays. They called the islands Bahamas, the shallow sea, and they built their villages along the coasts, leaving behind shell middens and carved wooden zemis, the small sacred figures that connected them to the spiritual world, humming beneath the surface of everyday life. They paddled dugout canoes between islands that Europeans would later spend centuries arguing over, trading cassava and cotton, and carved ornaments with the ease of people who understood that the sea was not a barrier, but a road. By 1520, barely 30 years after Columbus first set eyes on them, the Lucian were functionally extinct, worked to death in Spanish gold mines on Hispaniola, carried off in slave ships, or killed by European diseases for which their immune systems had no answer. The most important fact about the Bahamas before the pirates arrived is that the Spanish considered these islands worthless enough to simply abandon. And that abandonment, that colonial indifference, was precisely what would make the islands so dangerous. The story of the Republic of Pirates cannot begin without understanding the world it was born to destroy. And that world was built on the shoulders of one man's obsession more than any other, King Philip II of Spain, who by 1580 had stitched together the largest empire the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. Philip ruled from Madrid with the practiced authority of a man who believed, genuinely, fervently believed, that God had appointed him shepherd of the world's Catholics and master of the Atlantic Ocean. His empire stretched from the silver mines of Potosi in modern Bolivia, up through Mexico and Cuba and Hispaniola, across the ocean to the Philippines, and back through Portugal and the Netherlands. Every year, fleets called the flotas departed from Seville, loaded with manufactured European goods, and returned groaning under the weight of New World silver. So much silver that its arrival was distorting the economy of all of Europe, causing inflation so severe that ordinary workers in Castile found their wages worth less each decade. The machinery of this empire ran on a simple principle. Spain owned the Caribbean, Spain owned the trade routes, and anyone who disputed that fact could argue with the cannons of the Spanish Armada. But Spain's empire contained a fatal flaw, one that Philip II saw clearly, but could never quite repair. The Caribbean was simply too big. The Spanish fleet was concentrated around the major ports: Havana, Cartagena, Veracruz, Santo Domingo. And between those ports lay thousands of miles of coastline, hundreds of uninhabited islands, and dozens of keys and inlets that no Spanish patrol vessel would ever chart or police. Smugglers discovered this vulnerability first. English merchants, barred by Spanish trade law from selling their goods in Spanish colonial ports, began supplying Caribbean colonists through back channels almost immediately after the colonies were established. John Hawkins made 3 slaving voyages to the Caribbean between 1562 and 1568, trading directly with Spanish colonists who desperately wanted English cloth, and enslaved Africans regardless of what Madrid said about it. And the Spanish colonial authorities largely looked the other way because they needed those goods too. The Spanish crown knew and fumed and threatened, and occasionally executed someone as a warning. But the smuggling continued because the demand was too powerful and the ocean was too vast to police. What transformed this low-grade commercial friction into something genuinely explosive was a single catastrophic decision made in 1568 at the Mexican port of San Juan de Ulua, when the Spanish viceroy, Martin Enriquez, ordered his warships to attack an English fleet sheltering in the harbor under what John Hawkins had believed was an agreement of safe conduct. Hawkins barely escaped with his life. 2 of his ships made it back to England. Francis Drake, who had sailed on that voyage as a young captain, watched the Spanish treachery from his own deck, and he turned that experience into something that would reverberate across the next century of Atlantic history: a personal vendetta against the Spanish Empire, prosecuted with a genius for naval warfare and a bottomless appetite for revenge. Drake would go on to circumnavigate the globe, to sack Cartagena, to destroy the Spanish fleet at Cadiz in 1587, and to serve as one of the chief architects of the Armada's defeat in 1588. But for our story, what matters most about Drake is not what he did. It is what he normalized. He proved that an English ship, with a small crew and audacity enough, could reach into the belly of the Spanish Empire and tear out handfuls of silver. And he proved that the English crown might quietly endorse such behavior if the political circumstances were right. He invented, in all but name, the figure of the privateer. The greatest achievement of this era, the thing that made everything that followed both possible and inevitable, was the invention of the legal fiction called the letter of marque. In its simplest form, a letter of marque was a document issued by a sovereign government that authorized a privately owned ship and crew to attack the vessels of an enemy nation. It was, in essence, a license to commit what would otherwise be called piracy, provided you only committed it against the right targets. The English and Dutch governments discovered that this was an extraordinarily efficient way to wage war at sea. Instead of building, crewing, and maintaining expensive warships, you could simply authorize wealthy merchants to arm their own ships and direct them against your enemies, keeping a share of any prizes captured. The privateers bore the costs, took the risks, and did enormous damage to enemy commerce. It was the privatization of naval warfare, and it worked with brutal effectiveness. By the late 1600s, the English government had issued letters of marque so liberally that hundreds of captains and thousands of sailors had built entire careers around licensed raiding. An entire culture had grown up around this economy of violence. Port towns that knew how to receive prize ships, merchants who knew how to fence captured cargo, lawyers who knew how to process prize claims, and crews who knew no other life. The danger embedded in this achievement, the thing that would eventually produce the Republic of Pirates, was the moment when the political circumstances changed and the letters stopped being issued, leaving thousands of trained maritime raiders with no legal outlet for the only skills they possessed. Yet the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 ended the War of the Spanish Succession with a stroke of a pen, dissolved the legal apparatus that had given privateers their legitimacy, and threw thousands of former sailors and raiders into a peacetime Atlantic economy that had no room for them. And the hunger and desperation that followed would produce something that no monarch in Europe had anticipated. With the fall of licensed privateering, the stage was cleared for something far more radical. The men who had learned to live by maritime violence did not simply return to shore and take up farming. They had tasted a life in which no man stood above you on the deck, in which the prizes were shared according to agreed articles, in which you ate what the ship ate, and suffered what the ship suffered in democratic equality. They had built, without ever quite naming it, a culture of rough shipboard egalitarianism, and they were not ready to surrender it simply because a king in Madrid and a king in London had decided to stop fighting. The question was where they would go. The answer was already waiting for them in the shallow, sun-hammered, Spanish-abandoned waters of the Bahamas. The island of New Providence sits near the center of the Bahamian archipelago, low and flat and green, surrounded by a harbor deep enough for sailing ships, but too shallow for the larger Spanish warships that might come to root them out. The Spanish had claimed it, half-heartedly settled it, half-heartedly abandoned it, and the English had planted a colony there in 1666 that struggled along without much support or purpose for decades. By the early 1700s, Nassau, the small settlement on New Providence's northern coast, was a ruin. A joint Franco-Spanish attack in 1703 and a second Spanish assault in 1706 had burned most of it down, and the few remaining colonists were too demoralized and too poor to rebuild properly. What Nassau had, though, was location. Situated directly athwart the shipping lanes between the American colonies and Europe, it was the perfect base from which to intercept merchant vessels traveling through the Florida Straits. It had fresh water, It had timber for repairs. It had a tavern. And after 1713, when the privateers found themselves suddenly unemployed, it had something more valuable than any of those things. It had no government worth mentioning, and therefore no law worth obeying. The man who understood Nassau's potential before anyone else, and who would turn that understanding into the founding act of the Republic of Pirates, was Benjamin Hornigold. And in 1715, he arrived with a small sloop and a crew of ex-privateers who had nowhere else to go. Hornigold had almost certainly served as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession, though the details of his pre-piracy career remain frustratingly opaque, lost in the administrative silence that surrounded men of his class. What we know for certain is that by 1715, when the Jacobite treasure fleet wrecked along the Florida coast, and thousands of pounds of Spanish silver lay scattered across the reef, Hornigold was already in Nassau, already operating as a pirate, and already beginning to build the loose organizational structure that would eventually crystallize into something resembling a state. He was not a romantic figure. He was not a philosopher or a theorist of democracy. He was a practical man who understood that a ship at sea needed order. That order required agreement, and that agreement required giving the crew some genuine stake in what they were doing. He did not invent the pirate articles, the agreements that governed life aboard pirate ships, but he refined them, enforced them, and modeled a style of leadership that was consultative rather than autocratic. And this, in the context of the brutally hierarchical world of 1715, was genuinely revolutionary. The pirate articles that governed ships operating out of Nassau were extraordinary documents by any measure. Every man who joined the crew received an equal share of any prize, not the owner's share or the captain's share, but an equal share, with small additions for the captain and the quartermaster in recognition of their responsibilities. Every man had a vote in major decisions: where to sail, whether to accept a prize, whether to engage an enemy warship. The quartermaster, the crew's representative, elected by the crew, held authority that could override the captain's commands in matters of ship's discipline. Injured pirates received compensation from the common fund: 150 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 100 for the left arm, the same for a right leg, slightly less for the left. These were not abstract principles. They were written down, signed, and witnessed. They were, functionally, a constitution, a social contract, governing the lives of men who had been entirely excluded from the social contracts of every legitimate society they had ever encountered. The single greatest achievement of the early Nassau Republic was not any individual raid, no matter how spectacular. It was the culture that Nassau created, a culture so attractive, so genuinely offering something that mainstream Atlantic society withheld, that it drew in men from every corner of the maritime world, with a force that alarmed colonial governors up and down the American coast. Nassau by 1717 held somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pirates. Contemporary estimates vary wildly, but the most careful historical reconstructions suggest that the island's pirate population at its peak may have constituted the largest concentration of working pirates in Atlantic history. They came from England and Ireland and Scotland, from the American colonies, from the Caribbean sugar islands, from West Africa, from France and the Netherlands and Portugal. Among them were formerly enslaved men who had escaped bondage and found in the pirate articles a world in which their labor was valued equally with any white man's. Among them were skilled navigators, carpenters, surgeons, and musicians. The full cross-section of Atlantic maritime labor, united by shared exclusion from the economy's legitimate rewards. The scholar Marcus Ridiker, who has studied this culture more carefully than almost anyone, calls it the hydrarchy, a maritime world turned upside down, in which the men at the bottom of every other hierarchy found themselves, briefly, at the top. The fact that this egalitarian experiment attracted so many men so quickly was not an accident. It was a verdict on the world that produced it. Hornigold himself never attacked English ships. This was a matter of personal principle, or perhaps personal calculation, that he maintained throughout his time as a pirate captain, limiting his targets to Spanish and French vessels, even as other Nassau pirates attacked indiscriminately. This restraint made him politically useful and practically influential. The other captains respected him without fearing him, and the colonial officials, who occasionally made contact with Nassau, found him the most tractable of a difficult crowd. He mentored some of the most extraordinary maritime raiders of the Golden Age. Edward Teach, whom history would remember as Blackbeard, sailed under Hornigold's command before acquiring his own vessel in 1717. Samuel Bellamy, who would become the wealthiest pirate in American history until his ship, the Whydah, sank off Cape Cod in 1717 with somewhere between 4 and 5 tons of treasure aboard, learned his craft in Hornigold's Nassau. Charles Vane, Olivier Labuse, and a dozen other captains, who would eventually terrorize Atlantic shipping, all passed through the Nassau network at one point or another. Hornigold was less a pirate captain than he was a civilizational anchor, the organizational intelligence at the center of a web of relationships that gave the Republic of Pirates its cohesion. What made Nassau's culture so genuinely democratic? And here we must be precise about what democracy actually meant in practice. Stripped of the romanticization that tends to accumulate around pirate history, was not the absence of hierarchy, but the accountability of those who exercised authority. A captain who proved cowardly could be voted out by his crew. A captain who hoarded prizes or cheated in the distribution of shares could be removed by a vote, placed under arrest by the quartermaster, and tried before the entire crew. the records from prize court proceedings and from the depositions taken from captured pirates show, again and again, men who understood that their captains served at their pleasure, that his authority was conditional, delegated, revocable. This was not merely an abstract principle. In 1717, the crew of Benjamin Hornigold's own ship turned on their captain, but the mutiny against Hornigold in 1717, the democratic mechanism working exactly as designed, the crew voting to remove a captain who refused to attack English ships and was therefore limiting their income, was the event that fractured the Republic of Pirates along a fault line that had always been present, setting in motion a chain of consequences that would lead to the most dramatic governance experiment the Caribbean had ever seen. It was at this precise moment, standing on the dock in Nassau in the early months of 1718, that the Republic of Pirates faced its defining crisis. The mutiny that removed Hornigold from his own command, the democratic process functioning as intended, crew votes overriding a captain's personal ethics, left a power vacuum at the center of Nassau's informal governance. Hornigold himself took his defeat with surprising composure, sailing away from Nassau, eventually accepting a royal pardon and reinventing himself as a pirate hunter in the service of the new Bahamian governor. His absence created space for a more radical, more chaotic, and ultimately more historically significant experiment to emerge. Then, from the sea itself, a solution arrived, or rather, it did not arrive so much as it assembled itself from the elements Nassau already contained. Driven by the crisis that Hornigold's fall had made unavoidable, the man who filled the space Hornigold left behind was not, as you might expect, a single charismatic leader who imposed order on the chaos of Nassau. Instead, what emerged was something more interesting and more unstable, a coalition of strong-willed captains who operated independently but maintained enough coordination to constitute a genuine power structure. At the center of this coalition stood Edward Teach Blackbeard, who by early 1718 had emerged as the most powerful and most feared pirate captain operating out of Nassau. Commanding the former French slave ship he had renamed the Queen Anne's Revenge, Teach was a physical phenomenon. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a black beard so long he reportedly tied it in small braids with ribbons during battle, and with a theatrical genius for terror that made him the most recognizable pirate in the Atlantic world. He cultivated his reputation as consciously as any marketing professional. Before battle, he reportedly threaded slow-burning fuses beneath his hat brim, surrounding his face with smoke and giving him a demonic, sulphurous appearance that terrified merchant crews into surrendering before a shot was fired. He understood, with sophisticated psychological clarity, that the reputation for violence was more efficient than actual violence. A crew that surrendered immediately could not harm his men, could not damage his ship, and could not destroy whatever cargo he was after. What is less well understood, because the mythology of Blackbeard tends to eclipse the reality, is how Teach governed his ships and how he governed his relationships with the other Nassau captains. He operated on the same democratic articles as everyone else at Nassau. The crew voted. The quartermaster held independent authority. The shares were distributed equally. More significantly, he functioned as one node in a loose political network that included Charles Vane, Benjamin Hornigold's old protege Jack Rackham, who would later become famous as Calico Jack, and dozens of smaller operators. This network was not a government in any formal sense. There were no written laws, no courts, no executive authority that could compel compliance. But it functioned as a government in the practical sense. It maintained norms, enforced expectations, coordinated actions when necessary, and provided a framework within which disputes could be resolved without the whole enterprise fragmenting into individual violence. The Republic of Pirates was a governance system built entirely on reputation, consensus, and the mutual recognition that the alternative, the full anarchy of every man for himself, would destroy the very thing that made Nassau valuable. The tension at the heart of this governance system was its relationship with violence. The same democratic articles that liberated the crew from the tyranny of a single captain also, paradoxically, gave the crew the power to vote for increasingly aggressive and indiscriminate raiding. Hornigold had maintained a personal veto over attacks on English shipping, and his removal demonstrated the fragility of any such individual principle. Without Hornigold's restraint, Nassau's pirates began attacking any vessel that looked profitable: English, Dutch, French, Spanish, Portuguese, without discrimination. The destruction they caused was not trivial. Between 1716 and 1718, Nassau-based pirates captured an estimated 400 vessels across the Atlantic world, disrupting trade routes, raising insurance costs, and making merchants in Boston, London, and Bristol furious. The colonial governors of South Carolina and Virginia sent increasingly frantic letters to London demanding military action. The governor of Jamaica complained that piracy had made the entire Caribbean an ungovernable sea. The economic and diplomatic pressure building on London was becoming impossible to ignore. The single greatest achievement of the Radical Republic was not military, it was political. In the spring of 1718, when Blackbeard sailed the Queen Anne's Revenge into the harbor of Charlestown, today's Charleston, South Carolina, blockaded the port with his small fleet and held the town's most prominent citizens for ransom. He achieved something that had never been done before and would never be done again. A group of outlaws with no state, no territory, no legal standing, and no diplomatic recognition successfully coerced a major colonial city. The ransom demand was spectacular in its specificity. Teach did not want gold or silver. He wanted medicine, a chest of medical supplies, particularly mercury, used at the time to treat syphilis, to treat his crew. He held Charlestown under siege for nearly a week. The colony's governor had no warships capable of opposing the Queen Anne's revenge. The merchants of Charlestown, watching their trade paralyzed, eventually complied. Teach got his medicine, released his hostages unharmed, and sailed away. The entire episode lasted less than a week and produced almost no casualties, but it sent a political message that reverberated across the Atlantic. Nassau was a power, not a nation-state, not a recognized belligerent, but a power capable of projecting force, of making demands, of extracting compliance from legitimate governments. It was, in the most literal sense of the word, a revolution in Atlantic political geography. The cultural dimension of Nassau's peak years deserves its own recognition. The pirates of the Republic were not simply brigands who happened to share their loot. They created an extraordinary counterculture, a set of values, practices, aesthetics, and social norms that stood in deliberate opposition to the hierarchical world they had rejected. Aboard pirate ships, music was not a luxury, but a requirement. Most large pirate vessels carried musicians, typically a fiddler and a trumpeter, who played during battles to keep up the crew's spirits, and who entertained during the long, idle hours between prizes. The musicians were often held to a less demanding watch schedule in recognition of their cultural importance, a provision that appeared explicitly in some ships' articles. The pirates celebrated their own feast days, drank communally from the same hogshead, and maintained elaborate rituals of inclusion and exclusion that cemented group identity. They dressed with deliberate extravagance. One deposition from a captured merchant describes a Nassau pirate wearing a velvet coat, a pair of breeches belonging to a French gentleman, and a hat with a feather so long it brushed his shoulder. Using clothing that they had stripped from prize ships as a form of theatrical class inversion, the man who, in legitimate society, could not afford a coat with buttons wore the coat of a merchant prince. The symbolism was understood by everyone. Perhaps most remarkably, the Republic of Pirates maintained a degree of racial inclusion that placed it in stark contrast with every legitimate Atlantic society of its era. The records are imperfect and the picture complicated. Piracy did not abolish racism, and some pirates kept enslaved people aboard their vessels. But the evidence consistently shows that formerly enslaved Africans and free black sailors served on pirate crews under the same articles as white crew members, receiving equal shares, equal votes, and equal recognition. One accounting of Blackbeard's crew from 1718 shows that approximately 60 of his roughly 300 crew members were black. The pirate captain Bartholomew Roberts, who would become important in a later phase of this story, reportedly had a crew that was 1/3 to one-half black at various points. In a world where the entirety of Atlantic commerce was undergirded by racial slavery, where the sugar and tobacco and cotton that generated the wealth the pirates were stealing had been produced by enslaved labor, the pirate ships of Nassau offered something extraordinary, a space where the color of your skin did not determine your vote, your share, or your standing. This was not equality as we might understand it today. It was equality as the 18th century could barely imagine it, and it existed here in the shallow waters of the Bahamas, decades before any philosopher would make the argument that all men are created equal. Yet in July 1718, the British government dispatched Captain Woodes Rogers to Nassau with a warrant as Royal Governor of the Bahamas, a small naval escort, and a proclamation offering pardons to any pirate who surrendered. And his arrival transformed the most successful pirate republic in history into a test of whether democratic outlaws could survive contact with organized state power. With the arrival of Woodes Rogers, the stage was cleared for the final and most dramatic act of the Republic of Pirates, a confrontation that would determine whether Nassau's radical democracy could sustain itself against the full weight of British imperial resolve. It was at this moment that the fault lines running through Nassau's governance between those who might accept accommodation with empire and those who could not would tear the republic apart with a violence that was both military and philosophical. Then, from the direction of the open Atlantic, came the men who chose defiance, and their choices would write the final chapter of the most extraordinary political experiment the Caribbean had ever seen. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau Harbor on July 26, 1718, and the scene that greeted him was not quite what he had expected. Charles Vane, commanding a small fleet of pirate vessels, sailed out to meet the incoming British ships and fired a cannon broadside, not quite an attack, more a demonstration, a statement that Nassau's pirates were aware of their own power and intended to make their position known. Vane then escaped through a shallow channel that Rogers's deeper draft warships could not follow, slipping away into the open Atlantic with a crew that had voted democratically to refuse the pardon. Rogers entered the harbor to find most of Nassau's remaining pirates in an ambiguous posture, willing to accept the pardon perhaps, but not ready to enthusiastically embrace British governance. Among those who took the pardon was, notably, Benjamin Hornigold himself, back in Nassau after his expulsion, apparently willing to accept official authority if it came with official recognition. Rogers appointed Hornigold as one of his primary pirate hunters, a choice that demonstrated both Rogers's pragmatism and his understanding of Nassau's internal politics. The man who had founded the Republic of Pirates would now be deployed to destroy it. Rogers was a remarkable figure in his own right, a former privateer captain who had circumnavigated the globe between 1708 and 1711, a man who understood maritime violence from the inside and who combined genuine physical courage with a talent for administration that was unusual in the rough and tumble world of colonial governance. He had not been sent to Nassau merely to offer pardons. He had been sent to transform it from an outlaw republic into a functioning British colony, which meant building courts, collecting taxes, establishing militia, and executing those who refused to comply. He understood, having spent years in the maritime world, that the pirates of Nassau were not simply criminals in the conventional sense. They were practitioners of an alternative economy and an alternative social order, and dismantling that order would require not just force, but the systematic construction of an alternative. He set about this project with impressive energy. Within weeks of his arrival, Rogers had begun rebuilding Nassau's fortifications, organizing a local militia, and establishing the machinery of colonial governance. He was not cruel, he was thorough. The pardoned pirates who remained in Nassau found themselves in a deeply uncomfortable position. They had accepted the king's pardon and technically renounced their former lives, but many of them had no skills applicable in a legitimate economy, no savings, and no realistic prospects beyond returning to the sea. Some found work as salvagers or small traders. Some hired themselves out as seamen on legitimate vessels. Some, and this was the group that most alarmed Rogers, quietly slipped away to rejoin former comrades who had refused the pardon and were still operating in the open ocean. The frontier between pardoned former pirate and active current pirate turned out to be much more permeable than Rogers had hoped. And this permeability generated the first real crisis of his administration, the greatest achievement of Rogers's tenure, the act that most forcefully demonstrated the British state's determination to reclaim the Caribbean from its democratic outlaws, was the trial and execution of 10 pirates in Nassau in December 1718. Less than 6 months after his arrival, the men were former Nassau residents who had accepted pardons and then returned to piracy, an act that under British law converted them from pardoned criminals back to active pirates subject to the death penalty. Rogers convened an admiralty court, one of the newly established instruments of colonial law, and prosecuted the case with meticulous adherence to legal procedure. Every man had counsel. Evidence was presented and contested. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence was death. And on December 10, 1718, Rogers watched all 10 men hang from a gallows erected on the Nassau waterfront, within sight of the harbor, where they had once voted on their own articles. Among them was a man named Thomas Anstey's, who had sailed with Bartholomew Roberts. Among them was a man whose name the records give only as Dennis, listed as a free black crew member. The executions sent a message that Rogers intended to be unmistakable. The Republic of Pirates was over. Nassau now belonged to the crown. What Rogers understood, and what makes his campaign historically significant rather than simply a colonial suppression, is that he was not fighting pirates. He was fighting an idea. The democratic articles that governed pirate ships were known throughout the Atlantic maritime world. Sailors on legitimate vessels had read them, heard about them, sometimes carried them in their pockets as aspirational documents, evidence of how things could be organized differently. The Navy was aware of this and terrified by it. In 1707, a mutiny on HMS Defiance had been directly inspired by the articles being practiced aboard Nassau pirate ships. In 1715, a group of sailors in Bristol had been arrested while trying to organize their merchant vessel according to pirate-style articles. The infection, as the naval authorities conceived it, was spreading, and Nassau was the vector. By establishing law, courts, and the gallows on New Providence, Rogers was not merely pacifying a colony. He was performing a political surgery, cutting out the heart of an alternative social order before it could fully articulate itself and spread. The cultural richness of Nassau during this transitional period, the brief, strange overlap of pirate republic and colonial administration, produced some of the most vivid documentary evidence we have about how the pirates actually lived. Rogers kept meticulous records. His depositions and court transcripts give us detailed portraits of pirate crews, their compositions, their customs, their disputes, their loyalties. From these records, we can reconstruct with some confidence the daily life of Nassau's floating democracy. Mornings began with a general council aboard each vessel, at which the day's sailing plans were discussed and voted on. Food and drink were held in common, with each man drawing equal rations, a provision that was enforced with particular strictness because hunger and thirst were the most immediate threats to shipboard harmony. Disputes between crew members were adjudicated by the quartermaster, who functioned as a combination of ombudsman, judge, and shop steward. The captain directed the ship in battle and navigated at sea, but in port he was merely first among equals, entitled to no special treatment and subject to the same articles as the most junior member of the crew. This was not an idealized picture. There was violence, there was injustice, there was the ever-present corruption that proximity to power produces. But the basic architecture of accountability was real, and the men who lived under it knew what they had. However, the execution of those 10 pirates in December 1718, combined with the lethal efficiency of Benjamin Hornigold's pirate hunting expeditions and the growing reach of Rogers's new colonial courts, drove Nassau's remaining pirates out of the Bahamas and into the open Atlantic, dispersing them like seeds on the wind, spreading their democratic culture to every corner of the maritime world, even as it destroyed them individually. This instability continued until the pirates, who refused Rogers's accommodation had scattered so widely across the Atlantic that tracking them became a military problem of the first order for the British Navy. The Republic of Pirates as a physical place, Nassau as the capital of outlaw democracy, was finished. But the Republic of Pirates as an idea, as a living experiment in democratic governance, carried in the minds and on the ships of several hundred determined men, sailed on into waters where Rogers's warships could not immediately follow. It was at this moment that the story's most extraordinary chapter began, in the form of two pirates who would carry the democratic experiment to its logical conclusions and into its final, fatal confrontation with empire. If Benjamin Hornigold was the founder of the Republic of Pirates and Blackbeard was its most theatrical product, then Bartholomew Roberts, who would become, by most measures, the most successful pirate in the entire history of Atlantic piracy, was its philosopher king. Roberts was a Welshman from Pembrokeshire, born around 1682, who had spent most of his adult life in legitimate maritime employment, working his way up through the ranks of merchant and naval vessels to become a skilled navigator and officer. He showed no particular interest in piracy until February 1719, when the slave ship on which he was serving second mate was captured by the pirate Captain Howell Davis off the coast of West Africa. Roberts initially resisted joining the pirates. The tradition, widely reported in contemporary accounts, is that Davis persuaded him with a combination of argument and compulsion, and that Roberts's resistance crumbled with a speed that suggests his scruples were perhaps less deeply rooted than he claimed. He joined Davis's crew. 6 weeks after Roberts joined the pirates, Howell Davis was killed in an ambush at the Portuguese island of Principe, and the crew gathered to elect a new captain. They chose Roberts. He had been a pirate for 6 weeks. He was chosen because the crew recognized, with the practical intelligence of men who depended on competent navigation for their survival, that he was the most capable seaman among them. The election of Bartholomew Roberts as captain in 1719 was the democratic mechanism of the pirate articles working at its most consequential. A crew of several dozen men, each with an equal vote, choosing leadership based on merit rather than birth, wealth, or political connection. It was, on a small scale, a model of rational governance that would not be matched in legitimate Atlantic politics for another 70 years. And Roberts proved the voters right. Under his command, the crew captured over 400 vessels in a career spanning from West Africa to the Caribbean to the Atlantic coast of North America. More than any other captain in the golden age of piracy, more than Blackbeard, more than Bartholomew Portuguese, more than any of the names that tend to dominate the popular imagination. What made Roberts not merely successful, but historically distinctive, was the intellectual seriousness with which he approached governance. The articles he drew up for his ships were the most elaborate and detailed of any pirate captain in the historical record. A genuine constitutional document specifying in precise terms the rights and obligations of every crew member, the procedures for resolving disputes, the compensation scales for injury, the rules governing the distribution of prizes, and the behavioral standards expected of all crew members in their dealings with each other and with prize crews. The articles included a provision that is stunning in its modernity. Any crew member who cheated the common fund of even a single dollar would be marooned. Abandoned on a deserted shore with only the clothes on his back, the integrity of the communal fund was treated as a matter of first importance, more serious than personal violence between crew members, more serious than disobedience to orders. Roberts understood, with an intuition that anticipated modern theories of cooperative institutions, that a community organized around shared resources could only survive if the members trusted completely that the sharing was honest. The moment that trust eroded, the community itself would collapse. His articles were, among other things, an anti-corruption framework for a democracy of outlaws, the single greatest achievement of Roberts's career. The act that most vividly demonstrates both the operational genius of pirate democracy and the terrifying scale of what Nassau's experiment had unleashed was the raid on the Portuguese fleet at Bahia in 1720. Roberts arrived at the harbor of Salvador de Bahia in Brazil to find 42 Portuguese merchant vessels assembled there, waiting for a naval escort before proceeding across the Atlantic. Any rational pirate captain assessing the situation would have turned away. 42 vessels represented a concentration of armed force that a single pirate ship could not hope to overcome, and the Bahia harbor was under the guns of a Portuguese fort. Roberts did not turn away. He sailed into the harbor in broad daylight, cut out the richest-looking vessel, a ship called the Sagrada Familia, carrying sugar, hides, tobacco, and 40,000 gold moidores, along with a cross set with diamonds that had been made for the King of Portugal, and escaped before the Portuguese naval escort could organize a response. The entire operation took less than an hour. The Portuguese governor, watching from the fort, apparently decided that engaging a pirate willing to attack a 42-ship convoy was not worth the casualties, and let Roberts sail away. The Sagrada Familia's cargo was worth an estimated £90,000 sterling at the time, a sum that, in contemporary terms, represented more than the annual income of a prosperous English nobleman. Roberts's cultural achievement was not in treasure, but in text. His biography, published by the journalist and hack writer Captain Charles Johnson in 1724, as part of a general history of the pirates, a work whose authorship has been debated for 300 years, with some scholars arguing that Captain Johnson was actually Daniel Defoe, contained a famous speech that Roberts supposedly gave to a captured merchant captain who asked why he had turned pirate. The speech, whether or not Roberts actually delivered it in these words, captured something genuine about the pirate worldview. In an honest service, there is thin commons, low wages, and hard labor. In this, plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. And who would not balance creditor on this side, when all the hazard that is run for it, at worst, is only a sour look or two at choking? No, a merry life and a short one shall be my motto. The speech was quoted in pamphlets, in sermons, in parliamentary debates. It became the definitive articulation of the pirate alternative, the manifesto of the Republic of Pirates, compressed into a single paragraph. The fact that it appeared in a published book, that the story of the Republic of Pirates reached the reading public in this form, was itself a cultural achievement of the first order. The pirates had found a chronicler, and their story would outlast their ships. The social composition of Roberts's crews illuminates the Republic of Pirates at its most demographically diverse, and therefore most genuinely revolutionary. At various points, his ships carried English, Welsh, Irish, Scottish, French, Dutch, Swedish, Danish, Portuguese, Brazilian, and West African crew members, bound together by the Articles and the equal share. His ships were among the first recorded instances of multilingual democratic governance. The Articles needed to be communicated across language barriers. The votes needed to be counted, and their results understood by men who might share no common tongue beyond the pidgin of maritime trade. Musicians played aboard his vessels in multiple traditions. Fiddles and horns from the Atlantic islands, drums from West Africa, instruments that no subsequent historian has been able to identify from the brief descriptions in court records. This cultural fusion, this involuntary but real synthesis of Atlantic musical and cultural traditions happening aboard a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean, was not incidental to the pirate enterprise. It was part of what made it magnetic to the men who joined it, and part of what made it terrifying to the men who opposed it. Yet on February 10, 1722, off the coast of West Africa at Cape Lopez, the Royal Navy warship HMS Swallow found Roberts's fleet at anchor, its crews substantially incapacitated by the previous night's drinking, and Captain Challoner Ogle's disciplined broadside cut down the greatest pirate captain of the Golden Age in the first moments of the engagement. And with him died not just a man, but the practical demonstration that democratic piracy could survive on the high seas. With the death of Bartholomew Roberts, the stage was cleared for the final phase of the story. The systematic hunting down of the Republic's scattered remnants, and the legal and ideological suppression of everything Nassau had stood for. It was at this moment that the British government moved from merely defeating pirates militarily to constructing, in law and in public rhetoric, a framework that would ensure piracy of the Nassau type could never reconstitute itself. Then, from the courts of London and the print shops of Grub Street, became a campaign to erase the Republic of Pirates from respectable memory. And the very thoroughness of that erasure is what tells us how seriously the Empire took the threat. The trial of Bartholomew Roberts's surviving crew members at Cape Coast Castle on the West African coast in April 1722 was the largest piracy trial in the history of English law, and it was conducted with a consciousness of its own historical significance that makes the trial records unusually rich. 169 men faced judgment, the largest group of pirates ever prosecuted at a single proceeding. The presiding officer was Sir Challoner Ogle, freshly knighted for his role in Roberts's death, and the prosecution was conducted with an evident awareness that this trial was not merely the conclusion of a law enforcement exercise, but a public statement about the relationship between democratic governance, social order, and the authority of the crown. The attorneys general involved spent considerable effort establishing not just that these men had committed piracy, but that piracy of the Nassau variety, organized, democratic, governed by articles, was a political offense against the legitimate structure of society, not merely a commercial crime. The distinction mattered. Commercial criminals could be rehabilitated. Political revolutionaries could not. The trial records give us some of the most revealing testimony in the entire history of the Republic of Pirates, because men facing death had less reason than usual to maintain the discretions of daily life. One deponent, a carpenter named James Phillips, who had served aboard Roberts's ship for 2 years, gave a deposition that described in remarkable detail how the democratic articles worked in practice, how votes were taken, how disputes were resolved, how the quartermaster's authority functioned as a check on the captains. He did not describe these things as criminal innovations. He described them as natural arrangements, the way any rational group of working men would organize themselves if they had the freedom to do so. Phillips was hanged, but his testimony survived, and historians have found in it one of the clearest windows into what the Republic of Pirates actually meant to the people who lived inside it. The man most responsible for the ideological suppression of Nassau, for ensuring that the Republic of Pirates was remembered as criminal chaos rather than democratic innovation, was not a soldier or a judge, but a writer. Captain Charles Johnson, whoever he actually was, published his General History of the Pirates in 1724, and it became one of the best-selling books of the 18th century, going through multiple editions and translations within a decade of its first publication. Johnson was a complicated figure. He clearly had access to genuine documents, trial records, and interviews with people who had known the pirates personally, and his factual reporting, where it can be verified against other sources, is often remarkably accurate. But Johnson also shaped the story he was telling. He emphasized the violence and the depravity. He presented the pirate democracy as chaos disguised as order, the articles as a confidence trick played by captains on credulous crews. He took care, in his portraits of individual pirates, to render them sympathetically enough to be interesting, but damnable enough to be safe, to construct a narrative in which the reader could enjoy the adventure while not being tempted to admire the politics. He was, in the most precise sense of the term, writing imperial propaganda, not crude, heavy-handed propaganda, but the subtle, seductive kind that works by telling most of the truth while carefully arranging which truths to omit. The greatest achievement of the suppression era, the act that most lastingly shaped how the Republic of Pirates would be understood by subsequent generations, was the systematic recategorization of piracy from political rebellion to individual moral failure. This recategorization happened in courtrooms, in sermons, in pamphlets, and in legislation. And it was so successful that most people, reading about pirates today, think of them first as adventurers or criminals, rather than as the democratic revolutionaries they actually were. The legal architecture of this recategorization was constructed through a series of parliamentary acts, the most important of which was the Act for the More Effectual Suppression of Piracy, passed in 1700 and strengthened in 1721, which established that pirates could be tried in colonial admiralty courts without juries, the traditional legal safeguard of English common law, on the grounds that the usual trial procedures were simply too cumbersome to apply to maritime criminals. This was a significant constitutional innovation. It created, for the specific purpose of suppressing democratic piracy, a class of defendants who were entitled to fewer legal protections than ordinary criminals. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. The pirates of Nassau had created the most democratic governance system in the Atlantic world. The empire responded by creating a special legal category in which democratic rights did not apply. The cultural dimension of the suppression, the battle over narrative and meaning, was fought partly through an institution that historians have somewhat neglected: the execution sermon. When pirates were hanged in Boston, London, Nassau, or Cape Coast Castle, the local clergy were invited to preach at the execution and to publish their sermons afterward. And these sermons were genuine cultural productions, carefully crafted arguments about the relationship between maritime labor, social order, divine will, and political authority. The Reverend Cotton Mather, the most famous preacher in colonial New England, presided at several pirate executions in Boston and published the sermons he gave there. And these sermons are extraordinary documents of imperial ideology. Mather described the pirates' democratic articles as a satanic inversion of legitimate authority, the equal share as a temptation of the devil, the vote as a mechanism of collective wickedness. He was not simply condemning murder and theft, which would have required no particular theological sophistication. He was condemning equality, arguing in print, in sermons delivered at public executions, that the idea that all men deserved an equal share was itself a form of spiritual corruption. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. In 1717, a prominent American clergyman stood before a crowd and explained, in the name of God, that equal distribution of labor's rewards was evil. The pirates he was condemning had simply pointed out, by practice rather than by argument, that it was not. The architectural legacy of Rogers's Nassau, the physical transformation of the pirate republic's capital into a functioning colonial city, deserves recognition as a cultural achievement of a different kind. Rogers built or rebuilt Nassau's fort, constructed a proper courthouse, organized the laying out of streets and the registration of property, and established the institutional infrastructure of a colonial city in less than 3 years of intensive work. He did this while simultaneously fighting off a Spanish naval attack in 1720. A fleet of 11 warships and over 1,300 soldiers who attempted to retake Nassau and whom Rogers, with minimal resources, managed to repel. And while managing a population that was deeply ambivalent about the entire project of becoming a British colony, Nassau today retains, in its street plan and in the orientation of its historic buildings, the physical imprint of Rogers's administrative energy. The city that grew up on the ruins of the Pirate Republic was, in a strange way, the Pirate Republic's most enduring monument. A reminder that the organization of political life, even when it involves gallows and admiralty courts, begins with decisions about who has the right to live where. However, the execution of the last major cohort of Nassau-connected pirates by 1726, combined with the increasing efficiency of Royal Navy patrols in the Caribbean and the systematic destruction of the informal networks of merchants and colonial officials who had quietly supplied and fenced pirate prizes, finally ended the golden age of piracy as a functioning social system. Though the ideas it had embodied would prove considerably harder to kill than the men who had carried them, this instability continued until the last ships flying the black flag had been chased down, their crews hanged or pardoned or scattered, and the Caribbean returned to the grim normalcy of imperial commerce, underpinned by enslaved labor. The Republic of Pirates, as a living political experiment, was finished. But history does not proceed in straight lines, and the suppression of the golden age of piracy was not the end of the story it had begun. What Rogers and Mather and the Admiralty courts had managed to do was drive the Republic of Pirates underground, to convert it from a territorial experiment into a memory, a story, a set of ideas that lived in the oral culture of maritime labor and emerged, transformed, in unexpected places for the next 2 centuries. The influence of the Republic of Pirates on the political culture of the Atlantic world did not end with the executions at Nassau and Cape Coast Castle, it traveled, carried in the bodies and memories of the thousands of sailors who had passed through Nassau or sailed under pirate articles into the ordinary maritime labor force of the 18th century, and it left traces in places and in ways that historians are still tracing today. The most direct and most extraordinary connection runs between Nassau's democratic articles and the political culture of the American Revolution. The argument requires care. It is not a simple, linear influence, a direct line from pirate articles to Declaration of Independence. But the circumstantial evidence is strong enough that dismissing it as coincidence requires more effort than engaging with it. Consider the geography. The most active recruiting ground for Nassau's pirates was the colonial port towns of the American Eastern Seaboard. Boston, Newport, New York, Charleston, Philadelphia. These were also, not coincidentally, the towns that produced the most vigorous opposition to British imperial taxation in the 1760s and 1770s. The men who led that opposition, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Paul Revere, moved in commercial and maritime circles that were saturated with the memory of pirate democracy. The taverns where the Sons of Liberty met were the same taverns where sailors who had seen Nassau firsthand drank and talked. The specific mechanism of transmission is clearest in the case of the maritime labor movement between 1720 and 1750. A series of labor actions on American merchant and naval vessels employed tactics, collective action, democratic voting, the withholding of labor, that were derived directly from the pirate tradition. In 1747, the most significant maritime labor disturbance in colonial American history broke out in Boston when Commodore Knowles of the Royal Navy sent press gangs to forcibly recruit Boston sailors for his warships. The resulting riot, which lasted 3 days, paralyzed the city and forced the governor to take refuge on a warship in the harbor, was organized using what one contemporary observer specifically called the method of the pirates: democratic deliberation among the affected workers, a written statement of grievances, and collective action to enforce their demands. The young Samuel Adams wrote about the Knowles riot with intense admiration, and it is not difficult to see in his analysis of it the seeds of the political philosophy that would produce, 20 years later, the Committees of Correspondence. The Pirate Republic had taught colonial workers how to act collectively, and colonial workers taught their political leaders how to govern democratically. And the American Revolution was in part the result. The connection between Nassau's democratic culture and the intellectual tradition of the Enlightenment is less direct, but equally intriguing. The Republic of Pirates was well known to European intellectuals through Johnson's General History, and through the broader discourse about natural law and political legitimacy that dominated intellectual life in the early 18th century. Rousseau, who published his Discourse on Inequality in 1754, had certainly read Johnson. The general history was available in French translation by 1726, and it was widely discussed in the salons of Paris and London. The Pirate Republic offered Rousseau and his contemporaries something valuable, an empirical example of a community organized outside the normal structures of legitimate authority, governed by consent and article rather than by law and heredity. Whether or not the Rousseau connection is direct, the fact that the Republic of Pirates and the theoretical tradition of social contract theory developed simultaneously, fed by the same intellectual anxieties about the relationship between natural liberty and civil society, is more than coincidental. The pirates were not philosophers, but they were doing philosophy, acting out, in the harsh conditions of the Atlantic, arguments that the philosophers of Europe were still struggling to put into words. The greatest cultural achievement of Nassau's long shadow, the most enduring contribution of the Republic of Pirates to subsequent human history, is, paradoxically, the myth that replaced it, the pirate myth that dominates popular culture today. The swashbuckling adventurer, the treasure chest, the Jolly Roger, the rum, and the freedom, is a heavily romanticized and significantly distorted version of what Nassau actually was. But embedded within that myth, like a seed within a fruit, is a genuine political memory. The memory of a moment when the most excluded people in the Atlantic world built something collectively, governed it democratically, and proved that the hierarchies they had been born into were not natural or inevitable, but chosen and maintained by force. That memory survived the executions, survived the propaganda of the sermons and the general history, survived 2 centuries of romantic distortion, and arrived in our own era in forms that continue to shape how we think about equality, governance, and the relationship between legitimacy and justice. Every time a film shows a pirate crew voting on a course of action, every time a story celebrates the black flag as a symbol of freedom from oppression, the ghost of Nassau is present, imprecisely remembered, romantically distorted, but real. The specific contribution of the Pirate Republic to the practice of written governance is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it tends to get lost in the drama of the ships and the treasure. The pirate articles, the written constitutional documents that governed ships out of Nassau, preceded the American Constitution by 70 years. They preceded the French Declaration of the Rights of Man by more than 70 years. They preceded the British Reform Acts by more than a century. They were not, of course, equivalent to those documents. They were rougher, simpler, more limited in scope, and entirely outside the tradition of civic humanism from which those later documents drew. But they achieved something that those later documents would struggle with for generations. They were actually implemented. The equal share was actually distributed. The vote was actually counted. The quartermaster actually held the captain accountable. The injured man actually received his compensation from the common fund. The gap between principle and practice that haunts the history of democratic governance was, on pirate ships, significantly narrower than it was in the societies that condemned those ships. This is not a small thing. The built environment of Nassau today carries traces of this history in ways that most visitors do not recognize. Fort Charlotte, constructed in the late 18th century, stands on ground that was originally fortified by Woodes Rogers in his campaign to establish colonial order. The streets of Old Nassau follow a grid that Rogers's surveyors laid out in 1718 and 1719, cutting across the organic disorder of the pirate settlement that preceded it. The Anglican Christ Church Cathedral stands near the site of the original parish church that Rogers established as part of his effort to bring religious and social order to the island. And Nassau Harbor, still one of the busiest ports in the Caribbean, is navigated every day by vessels that follow channels first charted by pirate ships, whose captains were elected by their crews. The geography of Nassau is a palimpsest of the Republic of Pirates, the original writing partly effaced, overlaid by centuries of colonial and post-colonial construction, but still legible to those who know how to read it. Yet the full significance of Nassau's democratic experiment would remain effectively invisible to mainstream historical scholarship until the late 20th century, when historians like Marcus Redicker, Peter Linebaugh, and Crease Lane began to look at the Republic of Pirates not as a colorful episode in the history of crime, but as a genuine and consequential experiment in Atlantic democratic governance. And their work would force a fundamental reconsideration of what the golden age of piracy actually meant. The Bahamas that emerged from the suppression of the Pirate Republic in the 1720s was a very different place from the free port that Hornigold and his compatriots had built. Woodes Rogers's administration transformed New Providence from an outlaw territory into a functioning British colony, and the logic of British colonialism, plantation agriculture, enslaved labor, racial hierarchy, gradually replaced the more chaotic but more equal arrangements of the pirate years. By the middle of the 18th century, the Bahamas were producing cotton and other agricultural commodities on the labor of enslaved Africans, the same fundamental arrangement that the pirates of Nassau had briefly disrupted, and that imperial power had worked so hard to restore. The slave population of the Bahamas grew steadily through the 18th century. By 1783, when the end of the American Revolution brought an influx of loyalist refugees and their enslaved property, the enslaved population was growing rapidly toward a majority. The men who had briefly sat as equals at the Nassau Common Table were now the property of men who had never heard of pirate articles. The loyalist refugees who arrived in the Bahamas after 1783 brought with them not only enslaved people, but the ideology of American loyalism, a conservative, hierarchical political culture that was in almost every respect the antithesis of what Nassau had stood for. These new settlers established plantation agriculture on the outer islands, built churches and schools, organized themselves into a planter class, and set about creating in the Bahamas the kind of stratified colonial society that the pirates had tried to dismantle. They were largely successful. The Bahamian economy through the 18th and early 19th centuries ran on the familiar Caribbean model. Enslaved labor producing agricultural commodities for export, with the profits flowing upward to planters, merchants, and the crown. The democratic memory of Nassau was buried under the economic logic of slavery, present in the folklore of the islands, in stories of pirates that Bahamian children still told each other centuries later. But absent from the official narrative of the colony, emancipation came to the Bahamas in 1834 as part of the broader abolition of slavery across the British Empire, and the decades that followed produced a social transformation whose outline is familiar from Caribbean history. The formerly enslaved population, now technically free but economically impoverished, struggled to establish viable livelihoods in an economy still largely controlled by the white planter class. The Bahamas' particular geography, hundreds of small islands, limited agricultural land, abundant marine resources, meant that its post-emancipation economy developed somewhat differently from the plantation islands of the Eastern Caribbean. Fishing, small boat trading, sponging, and wrecking. The salvage of shipwrecked vessels, which the Bahamian geography made both common and lucrative, became the economic foundations of Afro-Bahamian life. These were maritime occupations, and the men who practiced them lived in close connection with the sea that had produced the Republic of Pirates, a connection that preserved, in oral tradition and in practical culture, memories of Nassau's pirate years that the official history of the colony tried to suppress. The most significant cultural achievement of the modern Bahamas, the act that most directly connects the post-colonial nation to the democratic memory of Nassau, was the independence movement of the 1960s and the specific political vision articulated by its leader, Lyndon Oscar Pindling, who became the Bahamas' first black prime minister when the Progressive Liberal Party won the 1967 general election, in an outcome that dismantled nearly 2 centuries of white minority political control. Pindling was born in 1930 in Nassau, the son of a Jamaican police officer, and he studied law in London before returning to the Bahamas to enter politics. His political platform was explicitly egalitarian. The redistribution of economic and political power from the white merchant and planter class to the black majority that had been excluded from it since emancipation. He called this program the sufferer's struggle, using a term derived from Bahamian vernacular culture, and he pursued it with a combination of legal sophistication and popular mobilization that his opponents consistently underestimated. In January 1967, the general election produced a tie, and Pindling secured a governing majority by persuading 2 independent members to support him. An echo, whether Pindling knew it or not, of the Nassau pirates' practice of securing coalitions through argument and negotiation rather than force. The cultural renaissance that accompanied Bahamian independence in 1973 drew explicitly, if sometimes obliquely, on the pirate tradition. The Junkanoo Festival, a carnivalesque street celebration with African roots that had been practiced in Nassau since the 18th century, suppressed by colonial authorities and revived repeatedly by the black Bahamian population as an assertion of cultural identity, was recognized after independence as the national festival of the Bahamas, and its imagery and traditions were codified and celebrated as expressions of national heritage. The costumes of Junkanoo, with their extravagant colors and theatrical excess, echo in suggestive ways the theatrical dress of the Nassau pirates. The velvet coats, the feathered hats, the deliberate transgression of the sumptuary boundaries that legitimate society used to mark social rank, whether or not the connection is direct. Both traditions draw on the same deep Bahamian impulse, the impulse to decorate one's body as an assertion of dignity in a society that tried to deny it, to wear the coat of the powerful as a statement that the power itself could be challenged. This is not accidental. This is history speaking through culture across centuries of suppression. The architecture of independent Nassau preserves the Republic of Pirates in ways that have become increasingly self-conscious as Bahamian tourism developed around pirate imagery. The Pirates of Nassau Museum, opened in 2003, occupies a building designed to evoke the waterfront architecture of the early 18th century, and it presents the pirate history of the Bahamas with a sophistication that deliberately connects the Republic of Pirates to the democratic tradition. The museum does not present Blackbeard and Hornigold merely as adventurers or criminals. It presents them as participants in a radical democratic experiment, men whose pirate articles anticipated later democratic developments, whose social arrangements challenged the fundamental hierarchies of Atlantic society. This curatorial choice is itself a political act in deciding to frame the pirate republic as a precursor to democratic governance. The museum's creators were making a claim about the Bahamas' own national identity, asserting that the democratic tradition of Nassau is not something imposed by the British Empire or borrowed from the American Revolution, but something that originated here in these waters, among these people, before the philosophers had worked out the arguments. Yet the contemporary Bahamas faces challenges that connect it across 3 centuries to the fundamental unresolved tension of the Republic of Pirates. tension between the freedom of the individual and the justice of the collective, between the democracy that distributes power and the economy that concentrates wealth. A tension that no governing system, pirate or otherwise, has yet fully resolved. The Bahamas that exists today is a nation of 300,000 people spread across 700 islands, living in the shadow of two contradictory legacies. On one side stands the legacy of empire, the centuries of colonial governance, the plantation economy, the racial hierarchies that still shape the distribution of wealth and opportunity in Bahamian society, the dependence on foreign capital and foreign tourists that makes the Bahamian economy vulnerable in ways that Bahamian political independence cannot fully address. Tourism accounts for more than 60% of the Bahamian GDP, and the tourists come largely from the United States and Europe. And the hotels they stay in are largely owned by foreign corporations. And the mathematics of this arrangement would not have surprised the colonial governors who designed it to keep former colonial subjects dependent on their former colonizers. The economic geography of modern Nassau, the luxury resorts on Paradise Island, separated from the working-class neighborhoods of Nassau proper by a short bridge that might as well be a century, is a spatial diagram of the inequalities that the Republic of Pirates briefly disrupted, and that subsequent history rebuilt with such thoroughness. On the other side stands the legacy of Nassau itself, the stubbornly persistent memory of a moment when the most excluded people in the Atlantic world built something genuinely egalitarian in these waters. The Republic of Pirates lasted, in its most coherent form, barely 15 years, from Hornigold's arrival in 1715 to the last hangings in the mid-1720s. In that time, it governed hundreds of ships, thousands of men, dozens of nationalities, in conditions of extreme danger and genuine democracy. It distributed its wealth equally. It held its leaders accountable. It extended political rights to men that every other society of its era denied them. It failed ultimately because the empire it challenged was too powerful, and its own internal contradictions were too deep. Because the democratic mechanism that removed Hornigold also enabled the indiscriminate violence that justified Woodes Rogers. Because the equal share that attracted men of principle also attracted men of simple greed. It failed in the way that all genuine experiments in radical democracy eventually fail, not from want of principle, but from the difficulty of translating principle into enduring institutional form in the face of powerful opposition. The pirates of Nassau were not saints or heroes in the uncomplicated sense. They were people flawed, violent, sometimes cruel people, who found themselves in conditions that stripped away the disguises that normal society provides for its inequities, and who built, in those conditions, something surprisingly close to justice. And the fact that what they built was destroyed does not make it less real or less important, or less relevant to the questions that every society still struggles to answer: who deserves to vote, who deserves an equal share, and what we owe each other in the community of common risk. The story of Benjamin Hornigold, the man who was defeated by the democratic mechanism he had helped create, who watched his crew vote him out of his own captaincy, who responded to that defeat not with tyranny, but with acceptance, and who then spent his remaining years hunting down the republic he had founded, is, at its deepest level, a story about the costs of genuine democracy. Real democracy means accepting outcomes you didn't vote for. Real democracy means the mechanism is more important than any individual participant in it, including the founder. Hornigold understood this, and the understanding cost him everything he had built. The republic of pirates he left behind survived his departure, survived his transformation into a pirate hunter, survived the arrival of Woodes Rogers and the executions of December 1718, survived in the stories that sailors told each other in taverns in Boston and Bristol and Cape Town and Kingston, survived in the political culture of the American Revolution, survived in the labor movements of the 19th century, and survives today in the improbable, passionate, ongoing argument about what democracy actually means and who it actually includes. An argument that began, if we trace it far enough back, in the shallow waters of the Bahamas, on a rough wooden deck, where a group of outcasts gathered to count their votes, and the count came out against the man who had taught them to count. The Bahamas won its formal independence from Britain on July 10, 1973, and the man who led it to that moment, Lyndon Pindling, governed the islands for 25 years as Prime Minister, long enough to see the democratic principles of Bahamian independence solidified into institutional form, and long enough to see some of those principles compromised by the familiar pressures of power. He died in 2000, remembered as the father of the Bahamas, and the international airport in Nassau bears his name. Somewhere beneath that airport, beneath the concrete and the jet fuel and the tourist infrastructure, lies the ground where Woodes Rogers hanged his pirates, and where Benjamin Hornigold taught his crew to vote. The Republic of Pirates is 300 years gone, and the questions it was trying to answer: who deserves a share, who gets a vote, what we owe each other across lines of race and nationality and class, are still being asked in Nassau and everywhere else, and the answers are still, as they have always been, being decided not by philosophers or by kings, but by the people who do the work, count the votes, and live with the consequences, in a story whose final chapter has not yet been written. To fully understand what Benjamin Hornigold and the captains of Nassau created, we need to spend time with the actual documents, the pirate articles, in a way that most popular histories of the Golden Age skip over in their rush to get to the treasure and the rum. The articles that governed Nassau's ships were not uniform. Each captain drew up his own version, sometimes modified from voyage to voyage as the crew's composition and circumstances changed. But they shared a common architecture, and that architecture tells us something profound about what the men who wrote them understood to be the fundamental problems of social organization. Every set of articles began with the question of authority. Who commands, under what conditions, and subject to what constraints? The answer, consistently, was that the captain commanded in matters of navigation and battle, but only in those matters, and only so long as the crew maintained confidence in him. The quartermaster commanded in matters of shipboard discipline and the distribution of prizes. Neither held absolute authority. Neither was immune from the democratic check of a crew vote. This division of executive power, the separation of the navigation function from the administrative function, anticipated the constitutional thinking of Montesquieu and Madison by decades. And it did so not through philosophical reflection, but through the practical wisdom of men who had experienced the consequences of unchecked authority and were determined to prevent them. The articles also addressed, with remarkable specificity, the problem of economic fairness, the problem that Adam Smith would spend much of the wealth of nations trying to solve through the mechanism of the market. The pirate solution was not market-based. It was explicitly redistributive. Everyone who contributed labor to the enterprise received an equal share of its product, with adjustments for additional responsibility or additional risk. The captain's share was typically 1.5 times the ordinary share, not 10 times, not 100 times, the multiples that legitimate merchant ships used to compensate their officers. The surgeon received a premium because medical care was essential to the crew's survival and required specialized knowledge. The carpenter received a premium for the same reason. The musicians received a small extra allocation in recognition of their contribution to crew morale. These premiums were voted on by the crew and could be adjusted or revoked by vote. The articles, in other words, constructed a system of democratic wage setting, a primitive but functional collective bargaining agreement that guaranteed every worker a meaningful share of the enterprise's profits, while maintaining modest incentive differentials for specialized contributions. This was not socialism in any doctrinaire sense, but it was a genuine alternative to the wage labor system of legitimate maritime employment, and the men who lived under it knew the difference. The articles also addressed, more obliquely, but no less significantly, the question of what we might today call human rights, the limits on what any authority, even a democratically chosen one, could legitimately do to the individuals under its governance. The provisions against marooning as a punishment for most offenses, the compensation scales for injury, the right to a fair hearing before the quartermaster before any punishment was administered. These were protections of the individual against the collective, guarantees that even the majority decision of a democratic crew could not simply be visited on an individual's body without procedural safeguards. This aspect of the pirate articles has been almost entirely overlooked in the historical literature, which tends to focus on the democratic and egalitarian dimensions at the expense of the libertarian ones. But the protection of individual rights against majority power, the hardest problem in democratic theory, the problem that the American founders would wrestle with in creating the Bill of Rights, was present in rough and pragmatic form in the articles that governed Nassau's ships. The men who wrote those articles had experienced mob violence at sea. They had watched captains use crew support as cover for personal brutality. They understood from lived experience that democracy without individual rights is simply mob rule, and they built protections against it into their founding documents. No account of the Republic of Pirates is complete without the women. And the two most important women in this story, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, challenge almost every assumption about the golden age of piracy in ways that the popular mythology tends to flatten into simple adventure. Anne Bonny was an Irish woman born around 1700 in County Cork, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer who eventually emigrated to South Carolina with his family. She married a small-time sailor named James Bonny in 1718, apparently against her father's wishes, and ended up in Nassau at exactly the moment when Nassau was transitioning between its pirate republican phase and Rogers's colonial administration. There she met Jack Rackham, Calico Jack, a pirate captain whose ships and whose democratic articles she found considerably more appealing than the domestic life her marriage offered her. She joined his crew disguised as a man, though the evidence suggests that the disguise fooled fewer people than the legend claims, and she sailed with Rackham through 1720, participating in the raids that made him notorious, and eventually sharing his arrest and trial when Rackham's sloop was caught by a pirate hunter off the coast of Jamaica in November 1720. Mary Read's story is even more extraordinary, and in some ways even more revealing of what the Republic of Pirates actually offered to people who had no place in legitimate society. Read had spent much of her adult life cross-dressing as a man. She had served as a soldier in Flanders, apparently, before ending up on a vessel that was captured by Rackham's crew. Whether she joined Rackham's pirates voluntarily or under compulsion is unclear from the sources. But what is clear is that she fought alongside the rest of the crew with a ferocity that the trial records describe with evident astonishment. When Rackham's sloop was taken, the trial depositions reported that most of the crew were too drunk to fight. Rackham himself was apparently incapacitated below decks, and that it was Bonny and Read who attempted to defend the vessel, calling on the male crew members to come up and fight, and being largely ignored. Read reportedly shouted to the men cowering below decks that they were cowards and villains, and threatened to shoot them herself. The trial of Rackham's crew in November 1720 produced 2 sentences of death that were immediately stayed. Both Bonny and Reed pleaded their bellies, announced pregnancies, which under English law required postponing execution until after delivery. Rackham and the male crew members were hanged. Mary Reed died in prison, apparently of a fever, before she could be executed. Anne Bonny's fate is unknown. The historical record simply stops, leaving open the possibility that she was quietly released, that she escaped, or that she died in prison under a name that no one thought to record. What their stories tell us about the Republic of Pirates is not the romantic adventure of the legend women finding freedom on the high seas, but something more specific and more revealing. The pirate ships of Nassau were among the only places in the Atlantic world of 1720 where a woman's capacity to fight, navigate, and contribute to the collective enterprise was recognized as the basis for inclusion in the community. Regardless of everything else, the pirate articles did not mention gender. The vote and the share belonged to anyone who signed. This was not conscious feminism. The pirates of Nassau did not theorize gender equality, but it was gender equality in practice, at least for these 2 women in these specific circumstances. And that is more than virtually any other institution in the Atlantic world could claim. The financial architecture of the Republic of Pirates is worth examining in detail, because it tells us something important about why Nassau worked as well as it did for as long as it did, and why it eventually failed in the specific ways it failed. The pirate economy operated as a kind of primitive venture capitalism, with each voyage financed collectively and the returns distributed by written agreement. When a pirate captain decided to make a voyage, he recruited a crew by circulating his articles, essentially a prospectus, laying out the terms under which the voyage would operate. Sailors who signed received a guaranteed minimum share, provisions from the common fund, and the protections of the articles, disciplinary and compensation provisions. In return, they contributed their labor, their skills, and their willingness to accept the very considerable risks of the enterprise. The whole arrangement was financed by the prizes themselves. There was no initial capital investment, no debt to service, no investors to satisfy. The pirates took their initial vessels either by capturing them or by converting vessels they already owned, and from that point, the enterprise was self-financing. This economic model had significant advantages. It eliminated the intermediaries, the ship owners, the merchant houses, the investors, who in legitimate maritime employment captured most of the surplus value that sailors' labor produced. It aligned the interests of every crew member with the success of the enterprise, because every crew member received a share of whatever success produced. It provided genuine insurance against the risks of the work through the injury compensation provisions in a world where legitimate maritime employment provided no such protection, and it generated, among the men who worked under it, a degree of engagement and initiative that legitimate maritime employers found baffling and alarming. Contemporary merchant captains and naval officers regularly commented on the willingness of pirate crews to fight with a ferocity and effectiveness that exceeded what could be achieved through the normal mechanisms of naval discipline. The threat of flogging, the hierarchy of rank, the captain's absolute authority. They understood correctly that men fighting for a share of a prize fight harder than men fighting for a wage. The economic model also had fundamental limitations that contributed directly to the Republic of Pirates' eventual failure. The most important limitation was scalability. The equal share model worked reasonably well for crews of 40 to 100 men operating a single vessel, but became increasingly difficult to manage as success bred larger operations. Bartholomew Roberts, at his peak, commanded a small fleet of several vessels with a combined crew of several hundred men, managing the democratic articles across this larger organization, ensuring that every crew member on every vessel received their fair share, that disputes between vessels were resolved equitably, that the authority relationships between captains were properly defined, was an organizational challenge that Roberts's articles were not fully equipped to address. The records suggest that Roberts spent considerable energy managing intercrew disputes, and that the larger his operation grew, the more its organizational coherence depended on his personal authority, rather than on the democratic mechanisms his articles established. This was not a failure of principle. It was a failure of institutional design, the same failure that affects most young democratic institutions when they confront the challenges of scale. The second critical limitation of the pirate economy was its dependence on a specific market structure that it could not control. Pirates took prizes, but prizes needed to be converted into usable wealth. The captured goods needed to be sold. The captured ships needed to be disposed of. The captured silver needed to be exchanged for provisions, weapons, and other supplies. This required access to markets, and markets required connections with people in the legitimate economy. Merchants willing to buy stolen goods, port authorities willing to look the other way, colonial officials willing to accept bribes. Nassau, during its peak years, was embedded in an extensive informal network of these connections. Small-time merchants in the American colonial ports, corrupt officials in the Caribbean colonies, tavern keepers and chandlers throughout the maritime world, who saw no reason to refuse the ready money that pirate crews spent freely. When Rogers arrived in Nassau and began systematically prosecuting these network members alongside the pirates themselves, he was not simply attacking the pirates directly. He was dismantling the economic infrastructure that made piracy viable. Without access to markets, a captured prize was just a problem. Without access to provisions, A pirate ship could not stay at sea. The suppression of the Republic of Pirates was, at its economic core, a blockade, not of ports, but of the commercial relationships that gave the pirate economy its functionality. The transformation of Benjamin Hornigold from the founder of the Republic of Pirates to its most effective destroyer is one of the most psychologically complex stories in the entire history of the Golden Age. Most histories treat it as simple opportunism. A man who saw the writing on the wall and switched sides for self-preservation. But the evidence, read carefully, supports a more nuanced interpretation. Hornigold accepted Rogers's pardon in 1718 and agreed to serve as a pirate hunter. But the depositions and reports from his subsequent operations suggest a man who was genuinely wrestling with the meaning of what he had built and what he was now helping to dismantle. He hunted the pirates of Nassau with efficiency and apparent commitment, capturing several vessels, killing several former colleagues. But he also reportedly spared crews that he might have detained, accepted surrenders generously, and advocated within Rogers's administration for pardons rather than prosecutions when the circumstances allowed. He was not the most ruthless of Rogers's agents. He was something more complicated, a man trying to reconcile his genuine belief in the democratic principles of the pirate articles with his equally genuine conviction that the republic he had founded had become something more violent and more destructive than he had intended. There is a reading of Hornigold's career that sees in it a genuine theory of political development, a belief that the Republic of Pirates had served a historical purpose, had demonstrated what collective self-governance could achieve, and had now been superseded by a more stable form of democratic order. Rogers's colonial government was, after all, considerably more accountable to its subjects than most colonial governments. Rogers held public councils, consulted local merchants, and governed with an evident concern for the practical welfare of the colony that distinguished him from the more distant and more arbitrary colonial governors typical of the era. Perhaps Hornigold saw in Rogers's Nassau not the destruction of what he had built, but its institutional successor, a more stable, more legally grounded version of the governance principles that the pirates had worked out in practice. If so, he was not entirely wrong. The Bahamas, that eventually became an independent democracy in 1973, drew on both traditions. The pirate tradition of practical egalitarianism and the colonial tradition of legal governance, each tempering the excesses of the other over 3 centuries of complicated coexistence. Hornigold's fate: he was lost at sea in a hurricane in 1719, apparently somewhere in the Caribbean, while pursuing a pirate, adds one more layer of ambiguity to his story. He died in service to the empire that had outlawed him, hunting men who had learned everything they knew from him. In the waters he had made famous as the capital of outlaw democracy. The Republic of Pirates which had been born partly from his vision and partly from his failure, outlasted him by only a few years. But the history that the Republic produced, the history that traces from Nassau's democratic articles through the American Revolution's political philosophy, through the labor movements of the 19th century, through the independence movements of the 20th century, endures. Hornigold lost his command in a democratic vote. Everything that followed from that vote is still unfolding. The academic rediscovery of the Republic of Pirates as a significant historical phenomenon is itself a story worth telling, because it illuminates how ideological pressures shape the stories that get told about the past. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the golden age of piracy was treated by serious historians as a minor episode in the history of Atlantic commerce, colorful background noise against the real stories of empire, trade, and colonial settlement. The pirates appeared in histories primarily as problems to be solved, as obstacles to the orderly development of the Atlantic economy, as criminals whose suppression demonstrated the growing efficiency of British naval power. The democratic dimensions of their social organization were either not noticed or not considered significant. The racial dimensions, the substantial participation of black sailors in pirate crews, the relative equality that pirate articles offered across racial lines, were almost entirely invisible in historical writing that did not look for them. The transformation began in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s and 1990s as the new social history, history from below, history of ordinary people's lives and experiences, began to ask different questions of the same sources. Marcus Ridicker's Villains of All Nations, published in 2004, was the landmark text. A rigorous, meticulously sourced reconstruction of the golden age of piracy that placed democratic governance, racial inclusion, and economic egalitarianism at the center of the analysis, rather than at the margins. Ridicker's argument, building on earlier work by Christopher Hill and Peter Linebaugh, was that the Republic of Pirates was not an anomaly in the history of Atlantic labor, but its most extreme and most fully realized expression, the ultimate working out of the logic of collective action and democratic self-governance that ran as an undercurrent through the entire history of Atlantic maritime labor. His work forced a rethinking, not just of piracy, but of the entire political history of the Atlantic world, asking what it meant that the first functioning democracy in the Caribbean was run by outlaws, and what that fact revealed about the relationship between legitimacy and justice in the world that the pirates were born into. The academic debate that followed Ridicker's work has been productive and sometimes fierce. Critics have pointed out that the idealization of pirate democracy risks romanticizing genuine violence, that the same ships that distributed shares equally also practiced torture on captured prize crews, that the same captains who held themselves accountable to democratic votes, also kept enslaved people aboard their vessels. That the Republic of Pirates was built on the robbery of a maritime economy that was itself built on enslaved labor. These criticisms are valid, and the most careful historians of the Golden Age have worked to hold both truths simultaneously, to recognize the genuine democratic innovation of the pirate articles, while refusing to excuse the violence and exploitation that coexisted with it. The Republic of Pirates was not a utopia. It was a human institution, built by flawed people in desperate circumstances, doing the best they could with the materials available to them. The best they could do was, by the standards of its era, extraordinary. It was not good enough, by any standard, to justify the harm they caused. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and holding them together is the only honest way to understand what Nassau meant and what it means today. The period between the suppression of the Republic of Pirates in the 1720s and the American Revolution of the 1770s is usually treated in historical narratives as a kind of interregnum, a quiet half-century in which the Atlantic world digested the lessons of the previous era before the next great political upheaval. But the memory of Nassau was not quiet during this period. It circulated through the maritime labor force in forms that are difficult for historians to track precisely. Oral traditions, tavern stories, the manuscripts and pamphlets that moved between ports in sailors' sea chests. And it shaped the political consciousness of the men who would eventually make the American Revolution in ways that are only beginning to be properly understood. The specific connection runs through the practice of collective action. The sailors and dockworkers of the American colonial ports, Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, were among the most politically active segments of colonial society, and they were politically active in ways that derived directly from their maritime traditions. The committees of correspondence that coordinated colonial resistance to British taxation were organizational forms derived from the maritime tradition of collective decision-making. The town meetings that Samuel Adams used so effectively were democratic assemblies whose procedural culture owed something to the shipboard councils of the pirate era. The Sons of Liberty, who organized themselves in cells and maintained internal discipline through a combination of democratic deliberation and strong social pressure, were organizing themselves in ways that would have been familiar to the crew of any Nassau pirate vessel. The connections are not direct. There is no smoking gun document proving that Adams read the pirate articles, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming, and the recent historiography of the American Revolution is increasingly willing to acknowledge the maritime radical tradition as one of the revolution's intellectual sources. The French Revolution offers a parallel set of connections. The general history of the pirates was available in France from 1726 and it was widely read. The pirate captains appear in French revolutionary pamphlets as examples of popular governance, democratic accountability, and resistance to tyranny. The Jacobins, who took democratic theory further than any previous Western political movement, drew on a range of sources, and the pirate tradition, with its insistence on equal shares, accountable leadership, and the sovereignty of the collective, was among them. The resonance was not lost on the movement's opponents. Edmund Burke, writing his reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790, compared the Jacobins to pirates, meaning the comparison as an insult. The revolutionaries, by some accounts, took it as a compliment. What the Republic of Pirates contributed to the age of revolutions was not a complete political philosophy. It was not Locke or Rousseau or Paine. It was something more elemental, a demonstration. Before Nassau, democratic governance outside the narrow civic tradition of the Greek city-states and the Italian communes was a theoretical possibility, an argument, a hope. After Nassau, it was a fact. It had been done. A group of men excluded, impoverished, criminalized, had organized themselves democratically, governed themselves effectively, and built something that lasted. The demonstration was impure, imperfect, and ultimately unsuccessful. But demonstrations do not need to succeed permanently to have effect. They need only to prove the principle. Nassau proved the principle, and the men who made the American and French and Haitian revolutions, who argued that governance by consent was possible, that equal shares were achievable, that the hierarchies of birth and wealth were not natural, could point, if they needed to the shallow water harbor in the Bahamas, where it had already been done. No discussion of the Republic of Pirates and its democratic legacy is complete without Haiti, because Haiti is where the most radical implications of Nassau's democratic experiment were finally, fully, and permanently realized, and where the Atlantic world's terror of democratic equality was most nakedly exposed. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and culminated in the Declaration of Haitian Independence on January 1, 1804, was the only successful slave revolution in history, and it produced the first Black Republic in the Western Hemisphere. It was also, not coincidentally, the political event that terrified the slave-holding nations of the Atlantic world more than any other. More than the American Revolution, more than the French Revolution, more than any political development of the 18th or 19th centuries, the connection between Nassau's pirate democracy and the Haitian Revolution is not direct, but it runs through the maritime culture of the Caribbean in ways that historians are beginning to trace. The enslaved and free Black men who led the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Henry Christophe, operated in a Caribbean maritime world that was saturated with the memory of Nassau. The Black pirates of Nassau, who had served under the same articles as their white crewmates, received the same shares, cast the same votes were known throughout the Caribbean. Their stories circulated in the oral traditions of enslaved communities, carried by the sailors who moved between islands, preserved in the folk memory of people for whom any example of black equality was precious and dangerous. When Toussaint Louverture organized the enslaved population of Saint Domingue in 1791, he drew on political traditions, collective decision-making, democratic accountability, shared sacrifice that had been practiced in however rough a form on the pirate ships of Nassau. The connection is cultural, diffuse, and impossible to document with precision. But it is real. Nassau was one of the sources from which Haitian revolutionary consciousness drew, and Haiti was, in a sense, the republic of pirates brought to its logical conclusion, a community of people who had been excluded from every hierarchy of legitimate society, building something genuinely egalitarian on their own terms. In the face of the most powerful forces the world could bring against them, the parallel between the suppression of the Republic of Pirates and the suppression of Haiti is instructive. Both were destroyed not because they failed to function, but because they functioned too well. Because the demonstration that excluded people could govern themselves democratically was more threatening to the established order than any military challenge. France reimposed slavery on Haiti in 1802, just as Britain had imposed colonial order on Nassau in 1718. Haiti overthrew French control in 1804, as Nassau never quite managed to do. But both the Pirate Republic and the Haitian Republic were punished afterward by the international community in ways that made their continued existence as viable states functionally impossible. Nassau was economically strangled by colonial integration, and Haiti was economically strangled by the indemnity of 150 million francs that France extracted in 1825 as compensation for the property, including the enslaved people that Haitian independence had taken from French planters. Haiti finished paying that indemnity in 1947. The price of democratic self-determination in both cases was ruinous, imposed by the same Atlantic powers that had built their wealth on the exploitation that the democratic experiments had challenged. The Bahamas of the 21st century is a parliamentary democracy with universal suffrage, a written constitution, an independent judiciary, and a political culture shaped by the long history of struggle for democratic rights that connects through 3 centuries of colonial history back to the rough democratic experiments of the pirate era. The Progressive Liberal Party and the Free National Movement alternate in power with a regularity that suggests genuine democratic competition, and the Bahamas ranks consistently among the freest and most democratic nations in the Caribbean region. It is, by any reasonable measure, a success story. A small island nation that achieved independence, maintained democratic governance, and built a prosperous, if unequally distributed, economy in the face of colonial legacies and geographic challenges that would have defeated many larger nations. But the success is complicated by the same tensions that have always complicated the Bahamas' relationship with its democratic ideals. The economy is heavily dependent on tourism and offshore financial services, industries that create wealth but distribute it unevenly, and that connect the Bahamas to global capital flows over which Bahamian voters have limited democratic control. Immigration policy, particularly the treatment of Haitian immigrants and their Bahamian-born children, has generated persistent controversies about who belongs to the democratic community, controversies that echo, uncomfortably, the questions about racial inclusion that the pirate articles addressed more generously than almost any other institution of their era. Climate change poses an existential threat to a nation of low-lying coral islands, and the international negotiations over climate responsibility are conducted in institutional forums where small island nations have formal equality but practical powerlessness. A situation that would have been grimly familiar to the sailors who negotiated with empire from the deck of an outgunned sloop. The Prime Minister of the Bahamas today, Philip Brave Davis, who took office in September 2021, governs an archipelago that faces these 21st century challenges with a political culture forged in the crucible of colonial struggle and democratic aspiration. Davis is the son of a minister, educated in law, a member of the Progressive Liberal Party that Lyndon Pindling founded, a man who stands in a direct political lineage that runs from the independence movement of the 1960s back through the anti-colonial resistance of the early 20th century, back through the struggles of the post-emancipation Bahamian population to assert its political dignity, and back, ultimately, to the shallow water harbor where Benjamin Hornigold's crew gathered on a rough wooden deck and counted their votes. The connection is not mystical or sentimental. It is structural. Every democratic institution in the Bahamas today is built on foundations laid in the struggle for democratic rights that the Republic of Pirates began, that the colonial suppression interrupted but could not destroy, and that the independence movement of the 20th century finally institutionalized. Davis governs in the name of a democracy whose roots reach 3 centuries deep into Caribbean soil, and the questions he faces about equity, about inclusion, about the relationship between small nation sovereignty and global economic power are the same questions that were being argued out in rougher terms and under more extreme conditions on the pirate ships of the Golden Age. In the end, the most important thing that Benjamin Hornigold did was not sail a ship, or raid a prize, or even found the Republic of Pirates. The most important thing he did was lose a vote. He lost it fairly, in accordance with the democratic articles he had helped create, and he accepted the result. That acceptance, that willingness to honor the mechanism, even when the mechanism worked against him, was the act that gave the Republic of Pirates its deepest meaning. It proved that the democratic principles of Nassau were not merely instruments of convenience, to be honored when they produced favorable outcomes, and discarded when they did not. They were principles, genuine, binding, applicable even to the man who had articulated them most clearly. Hornigold walked off his own quarterdeck because his crew had voted him off, and the democracy he left behind him was more real for his departure. The men and women of Nassau built something in those 15 years that the world was not ready for. They built a community of equals in an age of hierarchy, a democracy of outcasts in a world of monarchies, a space of relative racial inclusion in the heart of the slave-trading Atlantic. They built it imperfectly, violently, at the cost of enormous harm to the people they preyed upon. They built it without philosophical justification, without legal sanction, without the theoretical framework that would eventually be constructed to explain why equality and democracy are right. They built it the way all enduring human institutions are built, through necessity, experiment, and the stubborn human insistence that things could be organized differently if you were willing to try. The Royal Navy destroyed their ships, and the Admiralty courts hanged their captains, and the preachers damned their souls, and the historians ignored their significance, and the popular imagination turned them into characters in adventure stories. And still the Republic endured in the political culture of the American Revolution, in the labor movements of the 19th century, in the independence movements of the 20th century, in the democratic institutions of the 21st century. Bahamas, 300 years after Woodes Rogers hanged 10 pirates on the Nassau waterfront. The shallow harbor where they sailed still reflects the same Caribbean sky, and the question they were trying to answer, the question of what we owe each other in the community of common risk, is still being argued over in those same waters, in a story that Benjamin Hornigold set in motion when he accepted the vote that ended his command. And that shows no signs of reaching its final chapter yet.